Good morning, students. Today, in lecture number 3 of in lecture number 2 of semester 6, we are going to discuss William Wordsworth concept of poetic diction. Dear students, in the previous lecture, lecture number 1, we have discussed the syllabus of this paper number 14. The paper entitled Introduction to Literary Criticism and Literary Terms is very easy to understand and also study the content of the critics. In the previous semester, we have studied Aristotle's views on tragedy. It was a very nice section, and we have also came to know the ideal ways of writing tragedies by Aristotle. And we have also studied Sir Philip Sidney, the well-known Renaissance writer, critic, social reformer, how he expects the literature of England as a classic one, because he was haunted for the classical literature like Rome, Italy, and the Greek. And now we are going to study the 6th semester, and this semester we have William Wordsworth, the well-known romantic poet, critic, very well highlights his views on poetry and the style and diction of poetry through his well-known work Preface to Lyrical Ballad, published in collaboration with S.T. Coleridge in 1798. And we have another section, that is F.R. Lewis, concept of business criticism. He also very well expresses his views as a critic on business criticism or conception of business criticism. And dear friends, as you might know that William Wordsworth was not only a poet but also a representative of romantic age. His poetry has marked a name in the literary arena. And so William Wordsworth is a well-known romantic poet, critic, and beside that, what he was, that we are going to study in this lecture. William Wordsworth, we have seen that he has written well-known poetries like Lucy poems, Daffodils, Solitary Reaper, and so on. In each and every poem, for example, the Solitary Reaper, because before William Wordsworth, there were many poets. For example, the British poetry start from Geoffrey Chaucer, the representative of 14th century, and was also known as the father of British poetry. British poetry of Chaucer represent the age of that time, each and every class of the society, through his poems, which were known as tales, Canterbury Tales, prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Then we have the 15th century Spanish poetries. Then we have Elizabethan poetry, very well known, famous by Shakespeare's sonnets. Then we have metaphysical poetries of John Milton. Then we have the classical poetries of the early 18th century, classical age or neoclassical age by Rape of the Law, like Rape of the Law by Alexander Pope. So Chaucerian poetries, Spenserian poetries, metaphysical poetries, Miltonic poetries, or classical or neoclassical poetries. Each and every poetry we have seen there represent the high class society. There, because when you go through the Rape of the Law, the common man nowhere mentioned over there. Only the glory, appreciation, praise to the high class representatives. So, being a representative of this lower rustic people, William Wordsworth want to represent the lower class, the rustic class, their language, their way of communication, as it is, by adding the little color of imagination. So the literature will become very much innovative and effective than the classical representation of high class. So in his preface to the lyrical ballad, the critical book, preface to the lyrical ballad, published in 1798 in collaboration with S.T. Coleridge, Wordsworth expect that the literature of this age of the time must be different from the earlier classical one. When he tries to mention in the manifesto of preface to lyrical ballad about the representation of common and rural or rustic man in literature at that time, what happens? The classical representatives, means the poets of the classical age like Pope and others, have mercilessly attacked on the views of William Wordsworth about the representation of lower rustic people in literature. So when these people have attacked on his views, at that time William Wordsworth became very much firm to represent these people, their way of communication, their language, their natures, their simplicity in the literature in general and poetry in particular. So, this preface to lyrical ballad is a well-known, critical, seminal book through which this William Wordsworth represent his views. And for the first time in the history of British literature, William Wordsworth has used represented the language of conversation of middle and lower class society, because initially only the high class king, queens and their overall natures presented in the poetry, but for the first time William Wordsworth became successful, though lot of attacks, to represent these middle and lower class people in literature. Because this advertisement, preface to the lyrical ballad of 1978, his object in adopting what was the purpose of William Wordsworth is that in adopting a simple diction means sahi rachna, simple style. Diction means style of poetry. In adopting this simple diction for his poems was merely the language of conversation of the middle and lower class of society was the poetic purpose. Because so he mentioned for the first time the simple diction to adopt for the poetic late. This is one. William Wordsworth's intention to adopt the simple diction, to adopt for the poetic pleasure was the middle and lower sections of this. Because initially these sections, according to William Wordsworth, were totally denied, rejected in the poetries. Because according to him, when such language of common and middlemen, because his firm belief on the middle and lower class conversation is that they are very much pure, chaste, and the each and every language is which they speak from the real bottom of their heart. Whatever they do, whatever they speak, that is totally real in the midst of the nature they do. But his total opposed to the classical, because whatever the earlier poets has written, in reality the pupils were not real, because we have seen in Rep of the Law the classical age that how Belinda pretends the pretension of his wealth. So the lower and middle class representatives of the society, according to William Wordsworth, they are far away from such pretension. Show, or the, we can say, the over extravagant natures, pleasures and routines. So this was the very purpose that Wordsworth mentions in front of the poets. But when each and every representatives of the age attacks on his view, purpose, so he, in the second edition of the Preface to the Lyrical Ballad, decides to represent the class pupil of this. Why he want to choose? Because in this first edition, he want to represent the simple diction or conversation or the language of these middle and lower class of the society's people. He want to simply adopt it and to represent in literature. That was his very first purpose. He mentions in the first edition of the Preface to the Lyrical Ballad. But when the neoclassical poet has attacked on him, so in the second edition of Preface to the Lyrical Ballad, which was published in 1800, William Wordsworth initially wants to represent them, but after the attack, he decided to represent it as it is, anyhow, beside the oppose of these neoclassical writers, and he was very much firm with his intention, the intention of representing these people. So what was his agenda, purpose? He mentions for the first time there is his principal object in these poems. What was his principal object? His principal object to use the language of lower and middle class of the society in poetry was his main object, is that was to choose incidents and was choose incidents and situations from common life. From his very purpose, object, uddesh, behind the selection of language of middle and lower classes that choose those incident and situations, ghatna and paristhiti, from common life means the common life, and to relate or describe them, and to relate and describe them, then throughout, as far as possible, throughout, as far as possible, in a selection of language, in a selection of language, really used by men, really used by men, really used by the men means the men of lower and middle classes of the society, really used by men, and at the same time, to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be represented, ordinary things should be represented to the mind, in an unuseful aspect. This is the thing that we want to accept or present. At the very outset, he mentions his object, his plan, his intention, behind the presentation. So after this aspect, he want to express why the language of common lower middle class man that he represents in the second one. Look at this, the beginning of the concept of poetic diction by William Wordsworth, very well highlighted in Preface to Lyrical Ballad, first edition, published in 1798, in which he mentions his plan of representing the conversation of lower and middle class of society in the literature. Then the neoclassical poets, the well-established poet of that time, goes against his very object intention. So, in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, second edition, Wordsworth firms with his intention and he decides to represent the lower middle common man in poetry. So, his object or principal object, मुख्य उद्देश्य, his principal object, he says, what was his principal object? Was to choose incident and situations. Look at this word which will helpful to you again and because the same words he uses often and often throughout his concept. So, incidents and situations, घटना and परिस्थिति, incident and situations from common life. Common life means the common man's life. And to relate and describe it means to form a relation with their incident and situations altogether and describe it properly. Because the incident and situations of common lives we have to bring the relation, coordination, order, and then describe. Means after this relation we have to describe the common man's lives, incident and situations one by one. Throughout means incident and situations of their total life, means without missing any single incident or situations he want to represent or describe throughout means through total life of their as far as possible means throughout means whatever however the poet want to possible represent he can means throughout, if not possible throughout, as far as possible. How long, how much is possible, but total. Then in a selection of language, because in a selection of really use it. Whenever the poet wants to select the language, he wants to use the language of poetry. The language of poetry must be the language of common life, incident and situations of their life throughout as far as possible really used by them must be the main area of language. Sometimes what happens, people seem that the language of common man is rustic, vulgar, illiterate people they are. So he also finds a solution for illiteracy, vulgarity, pastoral people, illiterate people. He says that what you do, and at the same time to throw over them a color, certain coloring of imagination. Because where there is possible, you throughout or at the same time to throw over them, to throw over that incident, situations, relation, description, the language used by them, we have to add just certain coloring of imagination, means just filtration, imagination, whereby when you add certain imaginations, colorings, decorations, by taking the incident, situations of common life or a description, you just add certain coloring of imagination. Then, Wordsworth says, the ordinary things should be presented in an unusual aspect. The ordinary things becomes extraordinary when we add the certain coloring of. So why we want to choose, why we want to take the language of such common lower men in poetries, this situation and incident, relate, describe throughout as far as possible the selection of language really used by adding a certain level of imagination. Why? That the very purpose behind this object, the very purpose he mentions in the further section. So dear friend, just you go through this language, that is very well helpful to you. So keep in mind what Wordsworth you want to say. This is the beginning of very thing. So you go through it. First second I will read was to choose incident and situations from common life, man's life, and to relate and describe them throughout, totally, as per person. If there is limitation, take later. In a selection of language created used by man, and once you take each and everything, just you throw over certain color of imagination, then what will happen? Ordinary thing should be presented in an unusual ways. They become extraordinary, and whatever the language the poets were using since the long, that will be not of any importance once you represent this common lower middle class man in British. So, dear friends, with this I stop here. In the next lecture, the very intention purpose of Wordsworth we will go through. Thank you very much.